Hey employers, you cannot state this as your salary when it's actually minimum wage. I applied last week for a barista job. I love being a barista, it just does not pay well. So when I saw I could be making $13.50 at this job, I was like, I'll go back to being a barista. $13.50 plus tips is an amazing rate for this area. I went in yesterday, had an hour-long interview, it went great. It wasn't until the end of the interview and when she sent me the offer for a job, turns out they pay $7.50 an hour. But after you factor in tips, you make around $13.50 an hour. So you're counting on half of your employee's salary to come from the generosity of your customers. You cannot say that is your pay rate when you are paying $7.50 and your customers are picking up the rest. Needless to say, I not only declined the offer, I sent them a very informative email that will hopefully make them not only reevaluate their pay rate, but change that job ad.
A misleading job listing goes viral, and for good reason, but the bigger story here is that people want to work. They're just dealing with a job market that doesn't help them to. I'm Yasmin Khan with Rebel HQ, and a TikToker recently called out a job listing for advertising an hourly pay rate that was significantly more than what she was actually offered. The job was for a barista position at a coffee shop, so it was in the hospitality industry, and they explained that they factored in tips when calculating the job's hourly pay rate. So yes, that is incredibly misleading, and yes, everyone knows how horrible the tip system is that we have here in this country. Most other nations just pay their hospitality staff a living wage, but in the US we pay them barely anything and let the customers pay them directly after they've already paid for the meal, which presumably already has the cost of labor factored into the price. But that's not what I want to talk about today. In one of the other lives that I lead, I do a lot of research on the job market, the labor force, etc. But for people who don't pay as close attention to this stuff, it's still not hard to see that the ways in which we work has changed significantly over the past couple of years. The way work is typically structured is highly flawed, or at least in most cases, it's stagnated where technology has shot ahead. Not only are offices struggling to keep up with technology, but they're also not keeping up with the lifestyle changes that come along with that technology. On top of that, they're not keeping up with the rate of inflation, so much so that the $15 minimum wage that so many activists are fighting for is already an obsolete figure. When the pandemic hit, so many of the problems people normally just dealt with during normal times became suddenly intolerable. The pandemic exposed how dire certain situations were, for example, how close so many Americans were to destitution, poverty, and homelessness. With so many Americans living paycheck to paycheck, the prospect of missing a single paycheck was enough to disrupt entire families and lifestyles. However, instead of seeing people desperately clinging on to whatever jobs they had, what we saw was the Great Resignation. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2021 alone, nearly 48 million Americans left their jobs. And the rate of resignation hasn't slowed that much as of March of this year. But here's the thing, even with those numbers, the labor force hasn't shrunk by much. Unemployment rates are actually going down, not up. People who are quitting their jobs aren't just sitting at home unemployed, they're leaving their terrible jobs for better jobs. The data doesn't play into the right-wing narrative that people will simply stop working if the government gives them a stimulus check of like $1,400. It does, however, play into how disconnected they are from average Americans, that they think that any one person can live off of that for very long. But we already knew that. The data does suggest, however, that people want to work despite what people like Kim Kardashian seem to think. I don't know who she's been talking to or who she's been working with, but most people, at least in this country, want to work. Especially when we look at the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, they not only want to work, but they want to feel useful, like there's some purpose in their lives and that they're contributing to something good. Polling data supports this, with many young workers saying that they'd accept a lower salary for a more meaningful position. Young workers also feel disrespected by their older colleagues who don't take them seriously for whatever reason. Millennials specifically were constantly being accused of being lazy and entitled at work, despite the fact that we're the most educated and least paid generation. Millennials had to grapple with old school ways of doing things that were not only regressive in thinking, but they were inefficient and reluctant to adapt to technological advancements. Gen Z, they're the first generation of truly digital natives. They see the world differently than any of the older generations, and they work differently for it, But that's part of their value in the workplace. That's how progress happens. But when it comes to job seekers and what they're actually looking for in employers, whether these are salaried or hourly positions, is fair pay, purpose, and opportunities for growth. They don't need pizza Fridays or happy hours or office Christmas parties. Those are perks, meaning those are bonuses on top of things that workers actually need. They don't replace them. And the more companies try to attract workers using antiquated systems, the more they'll find that their labor pool is leaving them and looking elsewhere.